Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're really going to kind of get into something that's pretty complex, I think, but really fascinating. And that is what happens as people with Dravet syndrome grow older. And just for everyone out there, remember, Dravet is pronounced Draves. And, our main source here is a really, I think, groundbreaking 2025 research article.
Mm.
And this was in Epilepsia. And, that's one of the top journals in this whole field. And what's so cool about this study is that, this is like the biggest one so far to really focus on adults with Dravet. And even better than that is they actually got, insights directly from caregivers who are really living with this, every single day.
Yeah, and it's interesting because while Dravet has been, studied for decades now, the focus has really always been on children. And this study's kind of neat because it's really shedding light on the long-term impacts. And, it even kind of starts to raise these questions about whether Dravet might actually have this neurodegenerative component, meaning that, brain function could get progressively worse over time, which is kind of scary.
Okay, so I'm intrigued already, but before we kind of get too far ahead of ourselves, I think we should make sure that everyone listening is, totally on the same page here.
Yeah.
So what exactly is Dravet syndrome?
Well, it's more than just epilepsy. Dravet is technically called developmental and epileptic encephalopathy, which is kind of a mouthful. But what that really means is that it affects both brain development and causes seizures. So it kind of hits you on two fronts there. And usually it starts in infancy, somewhere between 3 and 15 months of age. And almost all the cases are linked to this mutation in a gene called SCN1A.
So it's kind of like a double whammy then, affecting how the brain grows and causing these seizures. But this study focuses on adults, right? I'm a little surprised that there's not more research out there on adults with Dravet.
Yeah, it is surprising because when you look at the research, there's actually 7 times more research on children with Dravet than there are adults with it. So this study was really trying to fill that gap by looking at what happens, as people age with the condition.
So what did they find? Was it just about, like how seizures change over time?
Oh, it's so much more than that. One of the most alarming things they found came straight from the caregivers. A full 60% of them reported that they had actually seen their loved ones lose abilities that they used to have.
Wait, losing ability, so you mean like they could actually do something and then they couldn't anymore?
Exactly. And we're not just talking about like, small things here. These are like big declines in areas like thinking skills, speech walking, even things like climbing stairs or using their hands.
Oh, wow. That's heartbreaking and, kind of concerning too. How did they actually measure this? Were they just, taking the caregiver's word for it?
No, they actually used a ton of different methods to get data. They had these standardized assessments for, like everyday living skills, movement analysis, and get this, they even used home videos, which I thought was really cool. And then they had all these questionnaires that covered everything from their epilepsy history to, psychiatric symptoms.
Fun videos. That's pretty creative. But let's get into the specifics here. You mentioned, this decline in abilities. Where were they seeing this happen?
Well, one area was in what are called adaptive skills. So these are those kind of like essential abilities we need for just daily living, like getting dressed, being able to communicate, eating, things like that. And, everyone in the study had some level of impairment in these areas, which isn't too surprising with Dravet, but the older the individuals were, the worse their difficulties were.
So even though Dravet starts when they're babies, the impact can kind of keep getting worse as they get older.
Yeah, that's one of the big takeaways here, but it gets even more complicated than that. The study also found this link between the length of time someone used certain seizure medications, kind of sodium channel blockers, and how bad their adaptive skills decline was.
Hold on. Are you saying that the medications that are supposed to help with the seizures might actually be contributing to these problems?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility that this research brings up to really understand this. We need to understand a little bit about how these medications work. Think of sodium channels, like the brain's electrical wiring. And in Dravet, this wiring's kind of faulty, right? And that's what's causing all those uncontrolled electrical bursts that we call seizures. So these sodium channel blockers, what they do is they basically calm down those overactive brain cells, which makes seizures less likely to happen.
So it's like the longer someone is on these meds, the worse these broader developmental problems might become. It just seems so counterintuitive.
I know, right? It's definitely a complicated issue because while these sodium channel blockers are essential for managing seizures, this research kind of suggests that there might be these unintended consequences, especially with long-term use. And that's where, the need for new treatment approaches really comes in.
Wow, this is already a lot to take in, and we're just getting started here.
Yes.
So what else did the study find?
Well, they also found something really unexpected, which is they started seeing signs of Parkinsonism in people with Dravet. And these are those movement issues that you usually associate associate with Parkinson's disease, like stiffness, tremors, slowness. And the crazy part is they were seeing this even in younger adults.
Parkinson's-like symptoms in Dravet. I never would have guessed that. What did this actually look like in the people that they were studying?
Well, they were seeing things like chin on chest, which is, where the head tilts forward, and then something called camptocormia, which is like being bent over at the waist almost all the time, like they're constantly bowing. Then these aren't just subtle signs either. These can really affect a person's daily life. And just like with the adaptive skills, both getting older and using sodium channel blockers for a long time, were linked to more severe Parkinsonism.
So there's definitely a pattern emerging here, it seems like.
Yeah.
Older age and long-term use of these specific seizure medications are both linked to these worsening difficulties. What about walking? I remember you mentioned that they used home videos to study that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And they found that as people with Dravet got older, walking often became more and more difficult. And again, long-term use of these sodium channel blockers was connected to that. In fact, one type in particular really stood out, and that was phenytoin. A shocking 64% of those who couldn't walk had used phenytoin at some point, compared to just 20% of those who could walk independently.
Wow, that's a huge red flag. Could phenytoin itself be causing these walking difficulties in people with Dravet?
It's definitely a question that this research raises, and it really highlights why we need these more in-depth studies, that look at the long-term effects of these medications. But the findings go beyond just physical challenges, too.
Okay, so we've talked about, like physical and developmental challenges, but Dravet also affects social communication, right? Is that something that the study looked at?
Yeah, they definitely did. And the findings are pretty significant. Over half of the adults that they studied actually screened positive for some pretty serious difficulties with social communication.
So that automatically mean they have autism?
Not necessarily, getting an actual diagnosis would require much more in-depth evaluation, but it does kind of highlight that these social communication challenges are really common in Dravet, and they might even be overlooked sometimes, especially in people who also have intellectual disabilities.
So it's like another layer of complexity that you have to think about. Anything else that kind of jumped out at you from this study?
There's one more finding that I thought was really interesting, but it definitely needs, more investigation. It turns out that 11% of the people in the study screened positive for potential dementia.
Dementia, seriously, isn't that something that usually, happens to much older people?
Yeah, you're right. That's what makes this finding so surprising. It really makes you wonder about the long-term effects of Dravet on the brain. But it's important to remember that this was just a screening. It wasn't like a formal diagnosis, but it definitely points to a possible connection that's worth exploring further.
11% is a pretty significant number. I'm curious, what could the link between Dravet and dementia be?
Well, remember that SCN1A gene we talked about earlier, the one that's mutated in most cases of Dravet? Well, some research has shown that people with Alzheimer's disease, which is, the most common type of dementia, actually have lower levels of the protein that this gene makes. It's called NaV1.1.
Oh, so maybe there's some kind of shared mechanism going on there.
It's a possibility, but we need more research to really, confirm this link and figure out how it might work. Which brings us to the big question. Could Dravet syndrome actually be neurodegenerative?
I think we need a quick refresher here. What exactly does neurodegenerative mean?
Sure. So neurodegenerative diseases basically involve the progressive loss of brain cells and function over time. Classic examples would be Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, things like that.
And are you saying that Dravet might fit into that category?
Well, this one study doesn't completely prove that, but the findings definitely hint at it. Like the declining abilities, the Parkinsonism, the potential dementia link. These all kind of suggest that there's some sort of neurological decline happening, at least in some people with Dravet.
This is getting pretty heavy. What does this mean for people with Dravet and their families?
Well, it definitely changes how we think about Dravet. It's not just about managing the seizures anymore. It's about recognizing that there could be these much broader and more complex neurological issues that might come up and that these people might need long-term care and support.
So it's like a call to action for more research.
Absolutely. We need long-term studies that follow these individuals with Dravet, throughout their entire lives to really understand how this condition changes over time and to see if there are ways that we can prevent or at least slow down some of these, more debilitating outcomes.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room here, those sodium channel blockers. I mean, they're used to manage the seizures, but the study is also linking them to some of these pretty concerning findings. So what do we make of that?
Yeah, it's a tough situation because these meds can be life-saving, for controlling those seizures. But this research is definitely raising some concerns about their potential long-term consequences. It's really important for doctors and families to carefully weigh the benefits against the risks and to think about, exploring some alternative treatments that might not be as harmful over time.
So it's not just a simple case of, take this pill and everything's fine.
Not at all. It's definitely this balancing act, but this research doesn't mean that we should just throw sodium channel blockers out the window completely.
What are some of the key things that you think listeners should keep in mind about these medications?
Well, I think the first thing is that while they are an important tool for managing those seizures in Dravet, we have to be aware of their potential long-term effects, especially on things like those adaptive skills we talked about, movement, and even cognitive function.
So it's all about individualized treatment then.
It's exactly. The second thing is that using these medications for a really long time, particularly some types like phenytoin, seems to be associated with some of those more severe challenges that we talked about now. That doesn't mean that everyone who takes these meds is going to have those issues, but it's definitely something to be cautious about, and it really warrants, further investigation.
So being informed and making decisions, based on each individual person's needs.
Precisely. And then the final thing I would say is that this research really highlights the urgent need for new treatment approaches for Dravet. We need to find therapies that can effectively control the seizures without causing all these, long-term side effects.
You've mentioned new therapies a couple of times now. What might those look like?
Well, there are lots of different avenues that researchers are exploring right now. Some of them are focusing on addressing those underlying genetic mechanisms of Dravet,
Right.
trying to fix that faulty wiring, so to speak. And then others are looking for ways to protect the brain cells from damage, or even to promote what's called neuroplasticity, which is basically the brain's ability to adapt and rewire itself.
So it sounds like we need kind of a multi-pronged attack here.
For sure, it's going to require a lot of collaboration across different fields,
Mhm.
neurology, genetics, developmental pediatrics, and of course, working closely with the families themselves.
I'm curious, based on what we've talked about today, what are some of the questions that you would want to ask these researchers?
That's a great question. I think I'd be really interested to know if there are any, specific genetic or even environmental factors that might make some people with Dravet, more susceptible to those long-term effects of the sodium channel blockers. Like, why do some people seem to be affected more than others? And are there any kind of early warning signs or, biomarkers that we could look for that might help us identify those people who are at higher risk?
So if we could identify them earlier, maybe we can intervene earlier.
Exactly. Early intervention is key. If we can catch these things early on, we might be able to prevent some of these problems from getting, really serious. And of course, I'd want to know more about that potential connection between Dravet and dementia. Is it just a coincidence, or is there something real going on there? And if there is, what can we do to try to prevent it or at least delay it from happening?
It seems like this research has opened up a lot more questions than it answered, but in a good way.
Yeah.
It's really making us think about Dravet in a whole new light.
I totally agree. This study is challenging all of our assumptions, and it's really highlighting the need for more research, better support systems, and ultimately, better outcomes for all those people who are living with Dravet.
You know, as we've been talking about all of this, I keep thinking about the caregivers. They're the ones who are really seeing all of these changes firsthand in their loved ones.
Oh, absolutely. And their insights were so important for this research. I mean, it wouldn't have even been possible without them being involved. They're the ones who are providing that constant care and support. They're dealing with all the daily challenges of Dravet, and now they're seeing all of these, additional issues popping up. It's got to be overwhelming for them.
It really makes you realize how important it is to have good support systems for these families. I mean, and I'm not just talking about medical support. They need emotional support, practical help, you name it.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that these caregivers have access to all the resources they need, the information, a strong network to help them, deal with all of the complexities of Dravet.
This research has definitely changed how I think about Dravet.
Mm.
It really does have this neurodegenerative aspect. It's not just a childhood epilepsy syndrome anymore.
Yeah.
It's something that could require, ongoing care and support throughout a person's entire life.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in how we think about this, and it has some pretty big implications. We need to be thinking about things like long-term care facilities, specialized services, and of course, developing therapies that can specifically target that neurodegeneration, try to slow it down or even prevent it if
Yeah.
possible.
This whole deep dive has given me a lot to think about. What are some of the key areas that you think researchers and clinicians should really be focusing on moving forward?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to develop better screening tools for all of these non-seizure challenges, things that are more sensitive and specific. Because if we can identify these issues early on, we might have a better chance of intervening effectively. And I'm talking about, objective measures that can actually pick up on those subtle changes, not just relying on what the caregivers are observing.
So like early detection could be a game changer. What about new treatment options?
Yeah, that's another big area of focus. We need to keep searching for therapies that not only control the seizures, but also address these other aspects of Dravet. Therapies that can target those underlying genetic mechanisms that we talked about, protect the brain cells from damage, and promote the brain's ability to repair itself.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope, not at all. It's going to require a lot of collaboration across different disciplines like neurology, genetics, developmental pediatrics therapists, and of course, working hand in hand with the families.
Well, this has been an incredibly informative deep dive. I'm leaving with a sense of hope because of all the progress that's being made, but also a sense of urgency because there's still so much more to do.
I feel exactly the same way. This research is a call to action for all of us. We need to invest in research, support these families, and advocate for better care for everyone with Dravet, throughout their lives, because knowledge is power, and if we work together, I really believe we can make a difference.
Well said to all of our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Dravet syndrome. We hope that you've learned something new today and that you have a better understanding of this really complex condition and why it's so important that we continue to do research and support these families.
And remember, keep asking questions, stay curious, and be a part of the solution.
Until next time, keep exploring.